It was supposed to be just another ordinary Sunday. Michael Turner had driven 2 hours to the countryside, eager to explore a flea market famous for its rare antiques. The sky was grey, clouds rolling heavily, as if warning him of the storm to come. But Michael wasn't a man who paid attention to signs. Years of working as an insurance adjuster had made him numb to gut feelings. Wandering through the crowded aisles, he stopped at a weathered stall manned by an old woman with piercing grey eyes. On the corner of the table, half buried under faded fabrics, lay a small brass talisman. It looked ancient, almost forgotten by time. A strange pull forced Michael to pick it up. The moment his fingers brushed against the cold metal, a shiver ran down his spine. The old woman smiled faintly. "It calls to those who need it," she whispered. Michael laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. "How much?" he asked. "It's not for sale," she replied. Yet seconds later, she pressed it into his palm. "For you, no charge. Just don't lose it." Before he could argue, she disappeared into the crowd as if swallowed by the earth. Driving back, Michael kept glancing at the talisman resting on the passenger seat. There was something unsettling about its crude engravings. Symbols he couldn't recognize, lines etched deep as if done in desperation. That night, he placed it on his bedside table, unaware that his life had already begun to change. The first night was the hardest. Michael woke up drenched in sweat, his chest tight as though something heavy sat upon him. Shadows shifted in the corners of the room, his breath caught in his throat. A deep voice whispered his name, low and gravelly, but when he snapped on the light, nothing was there. Only the talisman, gleaming faintly in the dark. By morning, Michael convinced himself it was just a nightmare. Yet a lingering fear gnawed at his thoughts. He couldn't bring himself to touch the talisman, now resting like a predator by his bed. A simple piece of brass shouldn't scare a grown man, he thought. But it did. The following days felt unreal. Wherever Michael went, he sensed eyes watching him. At work, he caught his reflection smirking back at him. At home, the talisman seemed to move. He found it in places he swore he hadn't left it. The kitchen counter, his bathroom sink, even inside his coat pocket. Sleep became impossible. His face grew pale, his hands trembled. Friends noticed the change, but every time someone asked, Michael's voice cracked. "I'm fine," he'd mutter. But he wasn't. Every second felt like a countdown. For what? He didn't know. Only that something was coming. One evening, unable to stand it any longer, Michael searched the symbols online. Hours passed, and finally, he found something. An ancient curse, said to trap souls within a talisman, feeding on the fear of its holder. It was never meant to be owned, only carried until it chose the next vessel. His throat tightened. He tried to throw it away, but his fingers wouldn't open. It clung to his palm, searing his skin like molten metal. The old woman's words echoed in his mind. "Don't lose it." But it wasn't about losing. It was about never letting go. Michael's breaking point came 3 nights later. He awoke to find the talisman embedded into his chest, half melded with his skin. His scream was hoarse, eyes wide in horror. A voice filled the room, neither male nor female. "You are mine now." In the mirror, his own reflection sneered. Tears streamed down his face, terror consuming every fiber of his being. He wasn't just afraid, he was trapped. The talisman had found its new home, and somewhere in a dark corner of another market, the old woman waited for her next victim. But it wasn't over. For days, Michael became a prisoner inside his own body. The reflection was no longer his. It moved differently, grinning when he was crying inside. He screamed at the mirror, begged, pleaded, but no sound escaped his lips. Only the eerie smile remained, carved unnaturally on his face. Memories of his childhood, his parents, his dreams, all of it began to fade. The talisman wasn't just feeding on his fear. It was consuming his soul, replacing him piece by piece. People he knew avoided him now. Even his sister, who adored him, recoiled at the sight of his sunken eyes and that cursed grin. One night, driven by sheer desperation, Michael drove back to the market. He needed to find the old woman. He needed answers. But the market wasn't there, just an empty field overgrown with weeds, as if the place had never existed. Rain poured as he dropped to his knees, screaming into the void. For hours he sat in the mud, staring at the cursed talisman now burning against his skin. Lightning flashed, illuminating a figure in the distance. The old woman, or what was left of her. Her eyes were hollow, a wide grin splitting her face. "There is no escape," she rasped. "You carried it willingly. It chose you." Weeks passed. Michael no longer fought. His body moved without him now. He watched as he smiled at strangers, shook hands, laughed. The talisman had learned to mimic him perfectly. Deep inside, Michael wept. He was nothing but a passenger in his own flesh. Every night he heard the whispers of those trapped before him. They spoke of torment, of years spent waiting for someone else to pick up the cursed brass token. And somewhere out there, another market would appear. Another curious soul would find the talisman. Another life would end. Michael was ready, because now he was part of the curse. And he was hungry for release. The final night came quietly. Michael, or what was left of him, stood by the roadside market. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on a young man browsing with innocent curiosity. In his hand, the talisman gleamed. Their eyes met. For a brief second, Michael's true soul broke through, pleading silently. But it was too late. The young man smiled, unaware of the curse he had just accepted. Michael vanished with the wind, finally free. The cycle continued. Somewhere the old woman smiled. The talisman had a new owner. The air was heavy with the scent of rain as Robert Carmichael drove along the desolate countryside road. The windshield wipers fought against the drizzle while his thoughts wandered aimlessly. A 47-year-old antique dealer from Boston, Robert had seen enough of life to know that certain things carried stories far darker than they appeared. But none of that mattered tonight. He was simply exhausted from a long week and eager to reach the small town of Ashmore, where a recent estate auction promised rare finds. Upon arrival, the innkeeper greeted him with a warm smile. "You're here for the Holden estate auction, aren't you?" she asked, handing him the key. Robert nodded, forcing a polite smile. The town was eerily quiet, its empty streets lit only by the dim yellow glow of old street lamps. A creeping unease tugged at him, but he shrugged it off as fatigue. Yet something in the way the woman looked at him, almost apologetic, clung to his mind longer than he expected. The auction the next morning was held at the decaying Holden mansion, a vast structure left to rot for decades. The air smelled of mold and old wood. The crowd was sparse, mostly seasoned collectors like Robert. Among the dusty furniture and faded portraits, one item caught his eye: a small, ornate talisman, no bigger than a locket. Its surface was engraved with unfamiliar symbols, and the moment Robert laid eyes on it, a chill slithered down his spine. "Found in the master's study," the auctioneer announced. "No one knows its origin." Bidding started, and strangely, no one else showed interest. It was as if the room grew colder, quieter. Against his better judgment, Robert raised his hand. The talisman was his. Later, while loading the piece into his car, Robert overheard two locals whispering nearby. "That thing's cursed," one murmured. Holden was never the same after he found it. The other nodded solemnly, glancing Robert's way. "Should have buried it." That night, Robert sat by the fireplace in his room, turning the talisman in his fingers. He couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. The air around him felt thick, like the walls themselves were leaning in. He tried to laugh it off. "It's just an old trinket," he whispered, but his voice trembled. As he placed the talisman on the nightstand, he felt something brush past him, something unseen yet undeniably there. Sleep came fitfully. Shadows danced on the walls, shapes that didn't belong. At one point, Robert awoke to the sound of faint whispering. Heart pounding, he scanned the room. Nothing. Only the talisman, now resting on the floor, though he was certain he had left it on the nightstand. A cold dread settled over him. By morning, his hands trembled as he drank his coffee. The unease no longer felt like his imagination. It was real. Something had changed the moment he laid claim to that object. The following day, Robert decided to leave Ashmore early. There was a growing sense of dread gnawing at him. As he packed, the innkeeper approached, her face pale. "Mr. Carmichael, did you purchase that talisman?" she asked, wringing her hands. Robert hesitated, then nodded. Her lips quivered. "You need to leave it here. That thing, it's cursed. People who owned it, bad things happened to them." Robert forced a chuckle, though fear had already begun to bloom in his chest. "You don't really believe that, do you?" he asked. The innkeeper didn't answer. She simply stared at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Mr. Holden changed after he brought it home, spoke to things that weren't there. His family, gone, just vanished. The house, she trailed off. We don't talk about it. On the road back to Boston, rain hammered against the car. Robert kept glancing at the passenger seat where the talisman rested, wrapped in cloth. He tried turning on the radio, but all he got was static. Hours into the drive, his head began to ache, thoughts clouded with dark images he couldn't explain. He saw flashes, faces twisted in agony, rooms burning, screams echoing. None of it was his memory. Panic gnawed at him. He pulled over, breathing hard, sweat trickling down his temple. Gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened, Robert realized he was talking to himself, whispering prayers he hadn't uttered since childhood. "It's just fatigue," he muttered. "Just fatigue." Yet deep down, he knew that was a lie. Back home, Robert placed the talisman in his study, locking it inside a glass case. But the sense of being watched never left. At night, he'd wake up gasping, convinced someone or something stood at the foot of his bed. Mirrors reflected shapes that shouldn't be there. Doors creaked open on their own. The air smelled of earth and rot. Desperate, Robert contacted a historian friend. When the man saw the talisman, his face drained of color. This is not just an antique," he stammered. It's Mesopotamian, a binding charm used to trap souls. Robert's stomach turned. "What does that mean?" he whispered. "It means," his friend replied grimly, "whatever's trapped. Once out, desperate for answers, Robert visited an old library. The scent of aged paper filled his nostrils as he combed through texts about ancient Mesopotamian rituals. Each passage made his blood run colder. The talisman was part of a forbidden rite, an object meant not only to trap souls, but to feed on the life of its bearer until it could break free. That night, Robert dreamed of a vast desert under a blood-red sky. Shadows moved like living things, circling him. In the distance, he saw figures chained to stone pillars, faces twisted in agony. One turned toward him and screamed his name. He woke up drenched in sweat, his sheets tangled around him like restraints. The talisman sat on the nightstand, though he knew he had locked it away. His hands trembled as he pushed it back into the glass case. The next day, determined to destroy it, Robert sought out a local priest. The priest examined the talisman from a distance, refusing to touch it. "You've brought death into your home," he whispered. "This is no mere relic. Burn it. Bury the ashes in consecrated ground." Robert hesitated. A part of him felt drawn to it now, as if letting it go would be worse. That night, the air grew colder. A storm raged outside, but inside the house was deathly silent. He could hear breathing, shallow, ragged, yet he was alone. Gathering every ounce of courage, Robert placed the talisman in the fireplace. As the flames engulfed it, an inhuman wail erupted, shaking the very walls of the house. Shadows burst forth, clawing at him. He screamed, backing away, but the air was thick, suffocating. When the fire died, only blackened fragments remained. The air felt lighter, but Robert collapsed to his knees, sobbing. He felt hollow, as if something had been ripped from him. Days later, Robert sat in his study, staring at the fireplace. Though the talisman was gone, he still felt it. Whispers echoed at night. Shadows lingered too long. Sleep eluded him. The priest returned, pale and grim. "You destroyed the vessel," he said quietly. "But the soul is free now, and it knows your name." The morning sun rose over a silent house. Neighbors later said they hadn't seen Robert since. The study door remained locked, the windows blackened. Only the faint scent of earth lingered, and sometimes, if one listened closely, the whispers returned. Weeks later, police entered the house after concerned neighbors called. They found no trace of Robert, only ashes in the fireplace. On the study wall, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was a final message. "It watches. It waits. I freed it." And somewhere, far beyond the mortal world, something ancient smiled. It started like any other Monday. David Turner, a 46-year-old antiques dealer, found himself driving through the winding country roads toward a small estate sale outside of town. Business had been slow for months, and he hoped today would be different. The flyer promised old valuables from a reclusive widow who'd recently passed away. David wasn't one to buy into local superstitions, but the town whispered about the old woman dabbling in strange rituals. He brushed it off as small-town nonsense. The estate was an aging Victorian house, its paint peeling, windows clouded with dust. David parked his car and walked toward the front door, feeling a slight chill despite the warm air. The place smelled of mildew, and something else he couldn't place. Something metallic, almost like blood. Pushing the thought aside, he met the executor, a thin, nervous man named Gregory, who handed him a list of items. "There's one thing you should see," Gregory whispered, his eyes darting nervously toward the attic stairs. "It's unusual." David followed him upstairs, the wooden steps creaking under their weight. In the attic, under a dusty tarp, lay a small wooden box with intricate carvings. The air grew heavier as David approached. Gregory hesitated. It was locked in here, for years. No one dared touch it. They say it belonged to her husband, some kind of talisman. Curiosity got the better of David. He knelt, running his fingers over the carvings, feeling a strange warmth radiating from the box. "I'll take it," he said, voice steady despite the unease creeping into his chest. He didn't believe in curses. Not really. That night, back in his dimly lit shop, David placed the box on his work table. The store was silent except for the old clock ticking above the door. He studied the carvings closer. They resembled symbols he'd seen in old occult books. Carefully, he pried the lid open. Inside lay a black stone talisman, strung on a decaying leather cord. It was heavier than it looked, cold to the touch. As David held it, a shiver ran down his spine. His reflection in the shop window seemed wrong. The eyes staring back weren't entirely his. A moment later, the lights flickered. David forced a laugh. "Get a grip," he muttered, placing the talisman back in the box. Still, that night sleep evaded him. Every creak of the old building felt amplified. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. The following morning, David awoke groggy, his dreams fragmented but laced with a growing sense of dread. He convinced himself it was just his imagination, but the uneasy feeling clung to him. Customers who visited his shop left quickly, rubbing their temples, complaining of headaches or sudden chills. David tried to ignore it, but caught himself staring at the talisman box more often than he cared to admit. Days passed, and the strange occurrences grew. David's own reflection began to distort, his eyes sunken, skin pale. At night, he dreamed of a man whispering in a language he couldn't understand, offering him promises of wealth in exchange for something unsaid. David tried to rid himself of the talisman. He buried it, burned it, even threw it in the river. But every morning it returned, lying on his work table as if it had never left. Panic set in. The isolation gnawed at him. His phone rang, but there was only heavy breathing on the other end. The shop smelled of rot, though no source could be found. By the end of the week, David found himself sitting in front of the box, staring at it with bloodshot eyes. He barely ate, barely slept. The shop grew colder, the shadows darker. Something was feeding off him. He could feel it. He knew he couldn't go on like this. Desperation took hold. David researched ancient rituals, consulting dusty books he'd once mocked. He found mention of talismans that bind themselves to a soul, feeding off fear, regret, and loneliness. The only way to sever the bond, it claimed, was to offer another, a willing soul, desperate enough to take the burden. One rainy night, David sat in his shop, talisman in hand, staring at the door. He thought of Gregory, the nervous executor. Maybe he'd understand. Maybe he was desperate too. A knock echoed through the empty shop. David's breath caught. Slowly he stood, forcing a smile. "Come in," he called, voice hollow. "I've got something special to show you." Gregory stepped inside, his shoulders hunched, eyes wary. The storm outside raged, thunder shaking the windows. "You said you found something rare?" he asked, rubbing his hands together for warmth. David nodded, gesturing toward the box. "Very rare, ancient. Some say it grants fortune to those who dare to claim it." His voice trembled, the weight of his choice sinking in. "I want you to have it." Gregory stared at the box, hesitant. "Why?" "Because I trust you," David lied, his throat tightening. "You helped me find it. It's only fair." Gregory approached, reaching out with trembling fingers. The moment he touched the talisman, the air shifted. David felt the weight lift off his chest, his vision clearing for the first time in days. Gregory gasped, eyes widening as the talisman seemed to pulse in his grip. What is this?" Gregory whispered, horror dawning on his face. David forced a weak smile. "It's yours now." David watched as Gregory staggered back, the talisman now clinging to him. Guilt twisted David's gut, but there was no turning back. He could breathe again, the shop no longer suffocating him. "You'll be fine," David lied, patting Gregory's shoulder. "Just keep it safe." Gregory nodded slowly, too shocked to speak. Without another word, he stumbled out into the night, the storm swallowing him whole. Weeks passed. David's business improved, customers returning, the shadows retreating. Yet at night, he dreamt of Gregory's face, pale and hollow, the talisman burning against his chest. Deep down, David knew the curse was never truly broken. It had only shifted, waiting, feeding. Somewhere out there, Gregory was learning that the true price of the talisman wasn't wealth or power, but the soul itself. And soon, it would hunger again.